This is the story of a family that built two of the most powerful magazines in American history and watched everything they created get stripped away piece by piece. At the center of it is John Harold Johnson, the man who turned a $500 loan into a $250 million media empire. His Ebony magazine put black excellence on newsstands across the country. His Jet magazine became the weekly heartbeat of black America for over 6 decades. For half a century, the Johnson family's wealth seemed immeasurable. The president called John by his first name. Martin Luther King Jr. trusted him with stories no other publisher could touch. Forbes listed him among the richest people in the world many times. But behind the empire, the family was quietly falling apart, and today they are left with nothing. This is the story the magazine never printed about itself. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Born from Nothing and the $500 Gamble. To understand the fall, you have to understand the height of the mountain John Harold Johnson climbed. He was born on January 19th, 1918 in Arkansas City, a place where the dirt was rich, but the opportunities for a black boy were non-existent. His mother, Gertrude, worked as a cook for a levee camp along the Mississippi River, supporting her husband and keeping the family fed through back-breaking labor. His father, Leroy, struggled to provide, working at a sawmill for wages that barely covered the week's bread. They lived in a tin-roofed house near the river, in a town where black families had been living the same hard, narrow life for generations. John was a third-generation descendant of slaves. That fact was not ancient history when he was born. It was his grandfather's life, and the effects were still fresh. While the family struggled, John's father passed away in an accident at the sawmill in 1926. John was only 8 years old. It would not be the last thing the Delta would take from him. Just a year after tragedy struck, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 tore through the town. It left John's family homeless for 6 weeks. They lived on the levee with hundreds of other displaced families. His mother remarried a man named James Williams, but the town had nothing more to give. When John finished 8th grade, Gertrude discovered there was no high school in Arkansas City for black students. Rather than let his education end, John repeated the 8th grade, sitting in the same classroom for another year while his mother saved every penny. She saved for 2 years so they could leave that town forever. In the summer of 1933, Gertrude packed their lives into suitcases and bought 2 train tickets to Chicago. They arrived during the World's Fair, walking into a city that felt like another planet. For the first time, John saw black doctors, lawyers, and business owners. He enrolled at DuSable High School and stood out immediately. He became class president and editor of the school newspaper. On the night of his graduation, a teacher told him that Johnny Johnson was not a good enough name for the man he was becoming. That night, he chose the middle name Harold and walked across the stage as John Harold Johnson. After graduation, he landed a job as an office clerk at Supreme Life Insurance Company. His task was to read through black newspapers from across the country and summarize stories for the company president. He realized that if he was this hungry for black news, thousands of others were too. Reader's Digest had an empire for white America, but there was no version for black America. He decided to build it, but the banks turned him away. Every single institution in Chicago laughed at the idea of a black-owned magazine, but John's mother did not hesitate. She put her furniture up as collateral and borrowed $500. With that money, John bought postage stamps and sent out 20,000 letters to Supreme Life policyholders. He asked for a $2 subscription to a magazine that didn't exist yet. To his surprise, 3,000 people sent money. In June 1942, the first issue of Negro Digest was born. Within a year, it was moving 50,000 copies a month. John was 24 years old and had proven the world wrong. He had started with nothing but his mother's furniture and a dream. And within 3 years, he launched Ebony and changed the face of American media forever. Chapter 2, The Birth of Jet and the September that Changed Everything. By 1951, John Harold Johnson was already a success, but he wanted something faster. Ebony was a monthly celebration of Black life, but the community needed a weekly heartbeat. On November 1st, 1951, he launched Jet, a pocket-sized weekly priced at 10 cents. He called it the Weekly Negro News Magazine. The industry laughed, calling it a novelty that wouldn't last 6 months. What they missed was that Black readers needed a publication that showed up every week and spoke directly to their reality. Jet reported on politics, entertainment, and racial injustice with a voice that mirrored the way Black people talked among themselves in barbershops and beauty salons. For over 60 years, it never missed a single week. It became the Black Bible. But the moment that made Jet truly immortal didn't come from a celebrity profile. It came from a tragedy that the mainstream press was too frightened to print. In the summer of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was visiting relatives in Mississippi when he was kidnapped and murdered. His body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River, mutilated so badly his own family could barely identify him. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, was told to keep the casket closed. She refused. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." She held an open-casket funeral in Chicago, and then she called Jet magazine. John Johnson did what no other publisher dared to do. He published the photograph of Emmett's mutilated face in the September 15th, 1955 issue. That photograph was a lightning bolt. It went into hundreds of thousands of Black homes, churches, and community centers. No mainstream newspaper would touch it. Television looked away, but Jet put it in front of the community without apology. What happened next was a turning point in history. Rosa Parks later said that the image of Emmett Till was what she thought of when she refused to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus 3 months later. Civil rights leaders throughout the country credited that specific issue of Jet with igniting the modern civil rights movement. Jet was to the 1950s what social media is to the modern era. It made the invisible horrors of systemic racism impossible to ignore. That issue didn't just sell copies, it solidified Jet's reputation as the ultimate truth teller for Black America. It was a magazine that wouldn't blink, and that reputation would carry it through the turbulent decades to come. Chapter 3, The Golden Era of the Two Magazines. Through the late 1950s, the 60s, and into the 80s, Jet and Ebony were a juggernaut that had no comparison. At its peak, Ebony was reaching 2.3 million homes every month. Jet was putting out over 400,000 copies every single week. Together, they were the most powerful Black media operation the world had ever seen. The revenue was staggering, climbing from $30 million in the early 70s to nearly $250 million by 1990. John Johnson became a kingmaker. Presidents sought his advice, and the most famous people in the world, from Muhammad Ali to Aretha Franklin, trusted the JPC to tell their stories. If you were a Black artist, athlete, or politician, you hadn't truly made it until you were on the cover of Ebony or featured in the pages of Jet. Jet had a feature that became one of the most recognizable in American publishing, the Beauty of the Week. Every issue featured a Black woman alongside a short biography. It wasn't just about models. It featured teachers, nurses, and students. For many, it was a rare space where Black beauty was celebrated completely on its own terms. But the real power of Jet was its weekly consistency. A monthly magazine could miss the immediate impact of a court ruling or an assassination, but Jet was always there, reporting the news while it was still raw. It documented the legal battles of the civil rights era, the rise of Black power, and the quiet daily victories of the burgeoning Black middle class. By the 1970s, John Johnson decided to build a monument to his success. He commissioned the construction of the Johnson Publishing headquarters at 820 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago. It was an 11-story masterpiece, the first and only building in downtown Chicago designed and owned by a Black company. The interiors were a showcase of Black art, featuring works by the most significant African American artists of the time. The building wasn't just an office. It was a symbol of what Black business could accomplish. John had built a citadel on one of the most famous streets in America, proving that he was no longer just a publisher, but a permanent fixture in the American establishment. He had thousands of employees and a brand that reached an estimated 40% of all Black Americans. He was the first Black person on the Forbes 400. The empire was untouchable, or so it seemed. Chapter 4, Eunice and the Fashion Fair Empire. While John was the face of the business, his wife Eunice was building an empire within an empire. She had come up with the name Ebony, and in 1958, she launched the Ebony Fashion Fair. What started as a charity favor for a hospital became the largest traveling fashion show on Earth, visiting 190 cities a year across the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. Eunice was the creative soul of the company. Every season, she flew to Paris and Milan to buy haute couture directly from the most elite houses like Dior, Valentino, and Yves Saint Laurent. However, she faced a humiliating reality that the public never saw. These French design houses often refused to loan their clothes to a Black woman. They didn't think their brand belonged on Black bodies. Eunice's response was a masterclass in power. If they wouldn't loan the clothes, she would buy them. She spent upwards of $1.5 million of her own money every year buying entire collections outright. She became one of the most significant buyers of haute couture in the world. Yet the mainstream fashion press largely ignored her. Over 5 decades, she personally acquired more than 8,000 designer pieces and raised over $55 million for causes like the United Negro College Fund. She was a titan of industry who operated in the shadow of her husband, but her contribution was vital to the company's bottom line and its cultural prestige. In 1973, she took it a step further by launching Fashion Fair Cosmetics. She noticed that the models in her fashion shows had to mix their own foundations because mainstream brands didn't make shades for Black skin. She built Fashion Fair into a global powerhouse, sold in over 500 department stores worldwide. For decades, it was the only prestige makeup line for women of color. Eunice had identified a billion-dollar gap in the market that white companies had ignored for a century. She was a pioneer of the Black is Beautiful movement, using her wealth to prove that Black consumers deserved luxury and high fashion. But even as the fashion empire thrived, the family was hiding a private heartbreak that no amount of money or couture could fix. They were about to learn that some tragedies can't be outrun, even by a $250 million empire. Chapter 5, The Son They Could Not Save. Behind the $1 million checks and the Paris fashion shows, John and Eunice were carrying a heavy burden. For 20 years, they had tried to have biological children, undergoing painful tests at the Mayo Clinic, only to be told there was no explanation for their infertility. In 1965, they made the decision to adopt. They brought home a newborn boy, and named him John Harold Johnson Jr. 2 years later, they adopted a girl named Linda. John Sr. was transformed by fatherhood. The man who had spent his whole life building an empire suddenly made sure he was home for dinner every night and kept his Sundays completely free for his children. He finally had an heir to the throne he had built from $500. Then the nightmare began. The adoption agency had failed to screen the boy for genetic conditions. John Jr. was diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, a disease that causes the blood cells to misshape and clog vessels, leading to excruciating pain and organ damage. In the 1960s, there was no treatment and no cure. John Sr. watched his son grow up in constant agony. Despite the illness, John Jr. tried to follow in his father's footsteps. He worked as a staff photographer for Ebony and Jet and was known as a daredevil who loved motor racing, living life with the intensity of someone who knew his time was short. He was a constant presence in the JPC hallways, a reminder of the future John Sr. was building for. In December 1981, the end came. John Harold Johnson Jr. died at the University of Chicago's Weiler Hospital at just 25 years old. The loss shattered the family. John Sr. went back to work the following week, but colleagues said he was never the same. He kept his son's office exactly as it was. He kept his childhood bedroom untouched. For the next 24 years, those rooms remained frozen in time, a shrine to the son he couldn't save. The tragedy left Linda as the sole heir to a massive, complex media machine. John Sr. became even more obsessed with the business, perhaps to distract himself from the grief. He had built an empire meant to last generations, but he had lost the person he most wanted to hand it to. This grief would eventually manifest in a refusal to let go of the company, even when the world began to change around him. He stayed in the CEO chair far longer than he should have, clinging to the past while the digital future was already knocking at the door. Chapter 6: The Storm Nobody Was Ready For. John Harold Johnson died on August 8, 2005, at the age of 87. He left a legendary legacy, but the company he handed to his daughter, Linda Johnson Rice, was a house of cards. Print advertising had been shrinking since the 1990s, and by 2005, it was in a total collapse. Ebony's circulation had peaked and was now falling. Jet's weekly schedule, once its greatest strength, was now its biggest liability. Printing and shipping a magazine every 7 days was costing millions in a world where people were getting their news for free on the internet. Linda was running a 20th century company in a 21st century world. The headquarters on Michigan Avenue, once a symbol of power, was now a financial drain. In 2010, Linda was forced to sell the iconic building for just $8 million. The buyers gutted it and turned it into apartments. The Johnson name was literally stripped from the Chicago skyline. That same year, Eunice Johnson passed away at 93, leaving Linda alone to steer the ship. The 2008 recession had been the final blow. Advertising revenue didn't just slow down, it fell off a cliff. Magazines that had been profitable for decades were suddenly losing millions every month. JPC was carrying massive debt from the peak years, and there was no cushion left. Linda tried to pivot to digital, but the company was too slow. John Sr. had been so dedicated to the physical page that the company lacked the infrastructure to compete with new, nimble digital media outlets. The culture of the company was also stuck in the past. JPC had always been a family business, run on loyalty and tradition, but the internet doesn't care about tradition. By the time the urgency was undeniable, the resources needed to fund a digital transition were already gone. A company that once employed 2,000 people was bleeding money faster than any turnaround plan could stop. The loyalty of the readers, which had taken 70 years to build, was not transferring to the screen. People who grew up with Jet in their hands weren't interested in a Jet app. The bond was broken. Linda was left watching the empire her father built from a $500 loan disintegrate in real time, despite her desperate efforts to save it. The fall wasn't just about bad management. It was about the brutal reality of an industry that had decided to leave print behind. Chapter 7, The Liquidation and the Ultimate Betrayal. The end came quickly and painfully. In June 2014, Jet ended its 63-year print run. 2 years later, Linda did what her father vowed he would never do. She sold. Ebony and Jet were sold to Clearview Group, a private equity firm from Texas. After 71 years, the Johnson name was gone from the masthead. The new management failed immediately. They didn't understand the voice of the brands or the community they served. Freelance writers went months without pay, and the magazine's reputations were dragged through the mud in public lawsuits. In April 2019, the Johnson Publishing Company officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The empire was officially dead. The only thing left of value was the archive. 4 million photos of Black history. It was sold at auction for $30 million to a group of foundations to ensure it didn't disappear into private collections. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Fashion Fair Cosmetics, the brand Eunice had personally financed and built into a global power, also filed for bankruptcy in 2019. A group of investors bought it, including Desiree Rogers, a former JPC CEO and close family friend. Rogers had reportedly promised Linda and her daughter Alexa that she would not take the family's business. Linda believed her. But Rogers relaunched Fashion Fair through Sephora in 2021, rebuilding the brand with new formulas and packaging. The original pink tubes designed by Eunice were gone. The brand was thriving again, but the Johnson family had been completely cut out. Linda and Alexa described this as the biggest betrayal of their lives. The brands they had bled for were succeeding, but for someone else. Just think about that. An empire that once reached 40% of Black America, that sat on the Forbes 400, and that helped start the civil rights movement, was liquidated piece by piece. Today, the Johnson family owns nothing of what John and Eunice built. Former NBA player Junior Bridgman bought the magazines out of bankruptcy for $14 million as a gift for his daughter. That is how far the empire had fallen. From a global institution to a line item in a bankruptcy court. John Johnson's $500 had grown into $250 million and then vanished in less than 15 years after his death. The family was left with the memories, while the world they created was sold to the highest bidder. Chapter 8, What the Numbers Never Captured. John Harold Johnson started with $500 borrowed against his mother's furniture in 1942. He built a company that brought in nearly $250 million a year. He published the photograph of Emmett Till. He employed thousands and owned a skyscraper. He gave Black America a voice so steady that the rest of the world finally had to listen. But the collapse of this empire wasn't caused by a lack of influence. It was caused by the brutal shift of a business model that favored the new and the digital over the historic and the print. Linda inherited a company already in a tailspin, with a founder who stayed too long and a balance sheet that couldn't survive a recession. Whether anyone could have saved it is a question historians still debate. What is not up for debate is the magnitude of the loss. When JPC fell, it wasn't just a business that died, it was a cultural library. The names John and Eunice Johnson now belong to history, while the brands they built belong to investors. The empire fell, and the family was left with nothing. It took the internet less than 20 years to do what segregation and poverty couldn't: silence the Johnson voice. But every time you see a black-owned media company or a luxury makeup line for women of color, you are seeing the legacy of that $500 loan. They lost the empire, but they changed the world. So let's hear your thoughts in the comments below. Was Lyndon Johnson Rice dealt an impossible hand from the start? Or do you think there were moves she could have made to save the empire? And do you think Jet Magazine could survive today if someone rebuilt it with a real digital strategy for this generation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story hit different for you, like and subscribe. We cover the rises and falls that history tries to forget. See you in the next one.